This is another sign of the times, an analysis, and a commentary. Oil wars decimate economies. Burning through its financial reserves, Saudi Arabia is betting it can outlast its rivals. Call it the Saudi calculus. Oil prices were already plummeting 14 months ago when, at Saudi Arabia's insistence, OPEC put the global petroleum industry on notice. The member countries would not try to prop up prices by cutting production. "We don't want to panic," said Secretary General of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. "We want to see how the market behaves." Since then, the market has behaved in a way few could have predicted, including Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest oil exporter. The price of oil has collapsed under the weight of a growing international glut, made worse by slower growth in the global economy. And yet the Saudis keep pumping oil at virtually full capacity, and they have persuaded their Persian Gulf OPEC allies, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, among others, to do the same, despite mounting pressure from other big OPEC members to curtail production. It is a risky strategy, one that is already straining Saudi finances and threatening the kingdom's ability to continue providing generous social programs like subsidized housing and cheap energy that the royal family has long used to buy domestic tranquility. Oil provides more than 70% of Saudi government revenue, and though the Saudis still have about $630 billion in financial reserves, they are spending them at a rate of $5 billion to $6 billion a month. But so far, Saudi Arabia is essentially betting that it can win an oil price war of attrition, not only against its OPEC rivals like Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela, but also against non-OPEC rivals like Russia and the many shale oil producers in the United States that have contributed to the global glut. The Saudis argue that throttling back oil production for a short-term pop in the price would be throwing a lifeline to the shale producers in the United States, some of which have already shown signs of wilting in the current environment. Already, oil producers have dropped their rig count in the United States as bankruptcies spread in the oil patch, but daily production has remained resilient as the wells that remain become more efficient and as major oil projects in the Gulf of Mexico, conceived in an era of $100 a barrel oil, come online. On top of this, Iran can increase exports now that Western sanctions have been partly lifted, potentially raising its daily production well above the current level of 2.9 million barrels a day. With the world awash in oil, the Saudis fear that cutting back might achieve nothing but erosion of their own share of the market, which is one of every 9 barrels produced worldwide. All of this adds up to oil prices that are not likely to rise significantly higher anytime soon unless the Saudi kingdom suddenly changes course. If prices continue to be low, we will be able to withstand it for a long time, said the chairman of the kingdom's national oil company. As daring or even self-defeating as the Saudi approach might seem, it is a policy born of pragmatism. Whatever Saudi Arabia does with oil production, its two big OPEC neighbors, Iraq and Iran, the Saudis' biggest regional rival, might have their own economic and geopolitical reasons to keep pumping or even raising output. And Russia, a big non-OPEC producer, is embroiled in a financial crisis from plunging oil prices and Western sanctions that might give it little choice but to maintain production and take whatever revenue it can. The Saudis also need a high level of production to support their export network and their domestic refineries and petrochemical industry. In order to maintain an efficient economy in terms of investment, you can't be pushing your production up and down 500,000 barrels every time the market requires it to prop up prices. Still, the Saudis know that they are in for tough times and that their dependence on oil has left them vulnerable. At a time of great political ferment in the Middle East, the plunging oil prices have gutted the export revenue that drove economic growth in Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf countries in recent years. The Saudi kingdom is staring at a growing budget deficit and facing the specter of an economic recession. The Saudi government has already had to curtail some of its generous social subsidies, recently increasing consumer gasoline prices in hopes of finding a new way to monetize its oil assets and begin diversifying its oil-dependent economy. The kingdom has even floated the idea of a public stock offering for its national oil company. The Saudis still speak darkly of the 1980s when, as OPEC's swing producer, they curtailed production to prop up prices, but ended up badly burned when other producers did not go along, seeing its oil revenue and market share shrink. Saudi Arabia fought back with its own price war, with OPEC having about 1/3 of the world market. For the Saudis to agree to a cut would mean persuading producers outside the organization, potentially including Russia, to make comparable terms. Analysts say that such a deal would be difficult to arrange, though it could eventually become necessary. If Saudi Arabia cuts production on its own, what is next? Iran produces more. Iraq produces more. So what have they done? Pushed the price up temporarily, but lost market share, which they may have difficulty recovering. So they say. Also, Iraqis seeking to withdraw money from banks are told there is not enough cash. Hospitals in Baghdad are falling back to the deprivation of the 1990s sanctions era, re-sterilizing over and over needles and other medical products meant for one-time use. In the autonomous Kurdish region in the north, the economic crisis is even worse. Government workers and Kurdish fighters who are battling the Islamic State have not been paid in months. Already, there have been strikes and protests that have turned violent. These scenes present a portrait of a country in the midst of an expensive war against the Islamic State that is now facing economic calamity brought on by the collapse in the price of oil, which accounts for more than 90% of the Iraqi government's revenue. Analysts and officials, though, say much tougher economic times are ahead, even as they insist the war will be largely unaffected because of help from foreign powers determined to defeat the Islamic State. The United States, for instance, recently extended new loans to Iraq to buy weapons, and other countries are stepping up with donations of arms and ammunition. But Iraq, where nearly 8 million people rely on a government salary or pension, will probably be forced to make crippling budget cuts. The economic shock they fear could lead to large-scale social unrest, even as the country is pulled apart by war, displacement, and sectarian animosities. In a country increasingly fragmented along ethnic and sectarian lines, Shiite and Sunni Arabs and Kurds, and with a widening gulf between the public and the political class widely viewed as corrupt and ineffective, a government salary or pension is perhaps the last link between citizen and state. Cutting the salaries would represent the full destruction of the Iraqi people, some say. The government is also preparing for what could be a worst-case scenario, that oil prices fall further and the country faces economic conditions reminiscent of the sanctions period of the 1990s, which devastated the economy. But if there's one thing that the government is determined to keep spending money on, it is war. In recent years, when oil prices were high, the country could count on nearly $8 billion per month in oil revenue, compared with less than $3 billion last month. Salaries alone cost the government close to $4 billion per month. So then, there is an oil war going on all around the world, and it is continuing day by day. This is also another sign of the end of times as we know them, transition days, which is a time of extreme happenings, events, and changes, because it's still about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations, and that should be a very important question to ask. Remember, there is a spiritual side to things too. Again, Revelation chapter 16, verse 16. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. 17. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven, from the throne, saying, It is done. 18. And there were voices, and thunders, and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since humans were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. 19. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. 20. And every nation fled away, and the mountains were not found. 21. And there fell upon humans a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent, and humans blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceedingly great. Yes, it's time for the physical and spiritual manifestation of the book of Revelation, and all these are more signs. And this is what I see, think, and feel. Abba Father, Amen.